Hi, welcome my channel. Today's video is an inspiring story of a woman who rises above betrayal and injustice. Get ready for a powerful tale of triumph. The arbitration suite on the 41st floor of the Blackwell Tower was as cold and clinical as Clara Whitmore had expected: steel walls, glass panels, and a faint scent of disinfectant that did nothing to ease the knot in her stomach. She paused before stepping in, adjusting the gold pendant at her neck with fingers that trembled despite her best efforts to appear calm. The receptionist barely looked up before waving her toward the main conference room. Inside, everything was already in place: white leather chairs around a dark walnut table, 2 pitchers of water, and a neutral-faced arbitrator reviewing her notes. But Clara's eyes immediately found him. Nathan Blackwell, her soon-to-be ex-husband, sat like a king surveying a peasant's rebellion, relaxed, legs crossed, perfectly tailored navy suit unwrinkled, his posture exuding entitlement. His platinum watch caught the light just as he leaned back and smiled, not at Clara, but at the woman beside him. Sloane Mercer, the woman he'd left her for, looked barely older than their daughter. Draped in designer everything, Sloane whispered something into Nathan's ear and giggled, her manicured nails tapping against her lavender phone case like the entire proceeding was some kind of boardroom farce. Clara inhaled slowly, steadying herself. She would not flinch, not today. She had walked through fire for this man, sacrificed her career, her savings, her dreams, and now here she was, sitting across from him in a room where he planned to erase her from his empire like she was a clerical error. Her lawyer, Julian Reyes, greeted her with a nod and a whisper, "We're ready." Clara sat down, back straight, expression neutral. Nathan glanced at her briefly, his smirk thin and self-satisfied, then returned to his phone, no doubt checking stock prices or texting his PR team about the optics of this nuisance. Clara wanted to scream, but she didn't. Let him smile now. He had no idea what was coming. Just a year ago, Clara would have never imagined herself here, embroiled in an arbitration over assets she had never claimed as her own. Because for 2 decades, everything she and Nathan built was supposed to be theirs. The betrayal hadn't come like thunder. It was quiet, clinical. One evening Nathan came home late from a conference in Miami and told her he wanted to reevaluate their marriage. He used sterile, corporate language, like their life together had been a failed merger. Days later, she found out about Sloane Mercer, a woman Clara had once mistaken for an intern at one of Nathan's networking events. The shock hadn't even settled when Clara was served with arbitration papers. No conversation, no negotiation. Nathan had filed to legally separate all his business and personal assets from her under the guise of an amicable dissolution. But there was nothing amicable about what followed. In the weeks after, Clara watched their shared accounts disappear, funds vanishing into entities she had never heard of, properties quietly transferred out of joint ownership, her name removed from everything as if she had never existed. Their family home in Lincoln Park had been remortgaged without her knowledge. The condo in Aspen, sold. The luxury car Nathan had insisted they lease under her name, repossessed. When she questioned any of it, Nathan would respond with cool detachment, "It's business. Clara, don't make this personal." But how could she not? She had been there when Nathan walked away from a cushy job at an ad agency to launch his own tech startup. She had crunched their household budget down to cents, stretching her inheritance just to keep the lights on during the early days of Blackwell Technologies. When Isla was born, Clara gave up her marketing career completely. Not out of weakness, but out of belief in them. In the future they had promised each other. She had pitched in wherever she could, writing copy for his brand, designing presentations for early investor meetings, managing staff during his business trips. But none of that was on paper. None of that counted now. Nathan's narrative, curated by his lawyers, painted her as a privileged housewife, lounging in luxury while he built an empire with his own 2 hands. And the worst part? He believed it. He had rewritten history with the ease of a man who had always been allowed to do so. Clara remembered overhearing him on a call once. He thought she was asleep in the next room. "She's not getting a cent," he'd said with a laugh. "The arbitrator will eat it up. She didn't work a day in her life." That sentence had burned itself into her like acid. She hadn't said anything then. But now, as she sat across from him in that sterile conference room, she gripped the edge of the table and thought, "You may have erased me from the records, Nathan, but I remember everything." Arbitrator Evelyn Cho adjusted her glasses and gave the room a cool, even glance before speaking. "Let the record reflect that the arbitration session between Mr. Nathan Blackwell and Mrs. Clara Whitmore is now in session. Regarding division of marital and business assets." Her voice, calm but commanding, cut through the silence like a scalpel. Clara kept her gaze fixed on the polished table in front of her, her fingers laced tightly in her lap. Julian Reyes sat beside her, already flipping through a leather binder, the faint scent of his cologne oddly comforting. Across the table, Nathan's legal team moved with crisp efficiency. His lead attorney, Alan Drexler, a silver-tongued litigator with a reputation for steamrolling divorce cases, rose from his chair like he owned the air in the room. "Your Honor, we submit that Mrs. Whitmore has no legal or financial claim to Mr. Blackwell's business holdings." Drexler began smoothly. Blackwell Technologies was founded solely by Mr. Blackwell, built on his personal capital and managed exclusively by his hand. Mrs. Whitmore was not an employee, partner, or shareholder at any stage. He paused for effect. Her contributions, while appreciated, were entirely personal and informal, and do not equate to a legal stake in the company's valuation. Clara felt her stomach churn, but she kept her expression unreadable. She'd heard this version of the story a dozen times now, each time more polished, more dismissive than the last. Nathan didn't even look at her. He sat with his arms folded, gaze slightly averted, as if he were already bored with the proceedings. Sloane, in the back of the room now, watched with mild interest, as though it were a show she'd already seen and expected to end a certain way. Julian leaned toward Clara, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let him keep talking. It's good." Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and addressed the arbitrator. "Your Honor," he said, his voice firm, smooth as glass, "we have no objections to Mr. Drexler's claim, if it were true. However, we intend to demonstrate that Mrs. Whitmore's contributions went far beyond the personal. In fact, they were foundational to the creation and survival of Blackwell Technologies." Nathan finally looked up, just for a second, but the smugness in his eyes flickered. Just slightly. Clara's heart pounded. Her side of the story was about to be told. Finally, Julian stepped into the center of the room like a conductor before an orchestra, his voice steady and precise. "Your Honor, while the opposing counsel argues that Mrs. Whitmore had no formal role in Blackwell Technologies, we have compiled documentation, timelines, and testimony that paint a very different picture." He held up a thick folder and handed copies to the arbitrator and opposing counsel. "This packet includes early branding concepts, pitch decks, and internal emails, many of which were created or edited by Mrs. Whitmore in the company's foundational years. You'll also find evidence that her personal inheritance, totaling $190, was used to cover operational costs during Blackwell Technologies' first 18 months of operation." Julian let that hang in the air for a beat. Her sacrifice kept the company alive during its most vulnerable stage. Clara kept her breathing slow and controlled. She remembered every sleepless night, every moment Nathan had sat at their kitchen table, hunched over a laptop, while she drafted pitches and budgets on her own. She had done the research, found the angel investors, even hosted meetings in their living room while balancing their daughter Isla on her hip. There was no question, Blackwell Technologies was as much her creation as it was Nathan's. The only difference? He had put his name on the door. Nathan leaned toward his attorney, whispering something that made Drexler's jaw tighten. The illusion of control was starting to crack. Julian continued, "Furthermore, we have a sworn statement from Mrs. Whitmore's financial advisor confirming that her inheritance was liquidated with the intention of supporting her husband's venture. That makes her, by all legal definitions, an early investor." Arbitrator Cho skimmed the documents, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And yet her name was never listed on any incorporation papers or shareholder agreements?" Drexler challenged, his voice sharper now. "Intent does not equal ownership." Julian smiled, unbothered. "Correct. Her name was left off by Mr. Blackwell himself. We have testimony indicating that he advised her not to complicate the paperwork while the company was still finding its legs. He glanced at Clara. Mrs. Whitmore trusted her husband and didn't imagine she'd one day have to prove her worth in this setting. Nathan's smirk was gone now. He tapped his pen against the table. Rapid and uneven. Across the room, Sloane was no longer scrolling on her phone. She was watching Nathan, a wrinkle of unease forming between her eyebrows. Clara allowed herself the smallest breath of satisfaction. This was just the beginning. But already the tide was shifting. For the first time in this fight, Nathan wasn't the only one controlling the story. And Julian, calm, relentless Julian, was far from finished. Julian didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His next sentence landed with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Now, Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence of substantial financial misconduct by Mr. Blackwell, specifically the concealment of marital assets through offshore transfers and shell corporations. The room went still. Even Arbitrator Cho looked up, her eyes narrowing. Nathan froze mid-gesture, his pen halfway to his legal pad. Sloane, seated behind him, stiffened as if someone had just turned off the oxygen. Julian moved to the screen at the end of the room and clicked a remote. A series of financial records and wire transfer logs appeared, timestamps. Account names, dollar amounts. Over the last 8 months, Mr. Blackwell has moved approximately $7.8 million into offshore accounts registered under Go Tech Holdings and Novaro Trust, both shell companies traced back to his name through intermediary filings in the Cayman Islands. He clicked again. These transactions were made without disclosing their existence to Mrs. Whitmore or this arbitration proceeding. Drexler stood abruptly. Objection. This is highly irregular. Where did you obtain these documents? Julian didn't flinch. Our team retained a licensed forensic accountant after my client noted discrepancies in financial disclosures. All evidence was gathered legally and is ready for review. He turned back to the arbitrator. We also have a sworn affidavit from a former Blackwell Technologies accountant who was quietly terminated 3 months ago after questioning these same transfers internally. Nathan's face drained of color. He leaned toward Drexler, whispering furiously. The lawyer's composure wavered as he flipped through the packet in front of him. These accounts are private, business development ventures. He muttered, but it was weak. Even he knew it. Julian continued, if I may, Your Honor, some of these transfers were routed through personal accounts, and the funds were then used for non-business purchases. For instance, he clicked again. A purchase agreement appeared on screen. A penthouse apartment in River North. Bought in cash for $3.2 million. The buyer? 1. GOC, Gregory Oliver Carson. A pseudonym connected to one of Mr. Blackwell's shell entities. This apartment was then gifted to Ms. Sloane Mercer. A loud, sharp breath came from behind the table. Sloane's face had gone pale. What? She whispered, eyes darting between the screen and Nathan. You said that was yours. You said it was in your name. Julian gave her a professional nod. Not quite. It was technically purchased using funds from a marital asset, under an alias, and is therefore subject to division. He turned back to the arbitrator. We also have records of a yacht purchase, 3 large crypto transfers, and high-value art acquisitions, all undeclared, all concealed. Nathan finally exploded. This is absurd. You're treating me like a criminal over basic portfolio diversification. Arbitrator Cho raised a hand. You'll have your turn, Mr. Blackwell, but right now, I want to hear from Mr. Reyes's expert witness. Julian nodded. Our forensic accountant is standing by via video to confirm the chain of evidence and explain the paper trail. Nathan shot out of his seat. We need a recess, time to verify this fabrication. But no one was listening to him anymore. Clara, for the first time in months, felt the tide slam in her favor. Her ex-husband, the man who thought he was invincible, was now choking on the narrative he'd worked so hard to control. And the best part? The truth was only beginning to surface. The silence in the room stretched tight as Julian signaled the technician to begin the video call. A moment later, the face of the forensic accountant, Marina DePaul, appeared on the screen. Professional and composed. Good afternoon, she began, her voice clear through the speakers. I've reviewed Mr. Blackwell's financial activity over the last 12 months. Our findings indicate deliberate obfuscation of funds through layered transfers. Consistent with asset concealment, these were not incidental business transactions. They were targeted withdrawals, made in anticipation of this arbitration. Each word landed like a nail in a coffin. Clara watched Nathan stiffen, his jaw clenched so tightly she could see the muscle pulsing along his temple. Across the table, Drexler scribbled notes furiously, though it was clear the damage was done. This wasn't just a disagreement over ownership anymore. This was fraud, and it had been laid bare. But it wasn't Nathan who broke first, it was Sloane. She leaned toward him, her whisper harsh enough to carry. You said everything was settled. You said the apartment was in your name, paid for. Nathan ignored her, his eyes fixed on the documents Julian had handed out earlier. Nathan, Sloane hissed again, louder this time. Did you lie to me too? His hand shot out under the table, gripping her wrist. Not now, he muttered, voice taut with rage. Sloane yanked her arm away. Scandalized. You told me I didn't have to worry about anything. She snapped, no longer concerned about keeping up appearances. You said she was just some bitter ex-wife who didn't understand business. Her voice cracked on the last word. Was any of it real? Clara watched the scene unfold, her expression unreadable. She'd imagined this moment countless times, Nathan squirming under pressure. The mask slipping from his perfect public persona, but reality was even more satisfying. For once, he was the one scrambling to regain control. And it was slipping through his fingers like sand. Arbitrator Cho raised a brow. Ms. Mercer, please contain yourself or I'll have to ask you to leave the room. Sloane sat back in her chair, arms crossed tightly, but the fire in her eyes was unmistakable. Nathan, for all his confidence and charm, suddenly looked smaller, not defeated, not yet, but cracked. The man who had once strutted into boardrooms as the master of his domain now looked like someone trying to remember which lie he had told last. And Clara? She didn't need to gloat. The unraveling was doing the job for her. She simply folded her hands in her lap and waited. The reckoning had begun. Clara didn't plan to speak. She had told herself she'd let the evidence do the work. That Julian would handle it all. But as she watched Nathan squirm and Sloane unravel, something inside her shifted, something deep and long silenced. She straightened in her seat, cleared her throat, and spoke clearly, her voice low but unwavering. With all due respect, Your Honor, I think it's time I said something. The room turned toward her, including Nathan, who finally looked directly at her, not with smugness now, but something closer to alarm. Clara met his gaze, steady. For years, I let him tell our story. To friends, to family, to the world. I was the supportive wife in the background while he became the man in the spotlight. And I was okay with that. I believed we were building something together. Something that belonged to both of us. She paused, letting the words sink in. But what Nathan is trying to do now isn't just about money. It's about erasure. He's rewriting history so he can walk away clean, while I'm left with nothing but the scraps of the life we built. She turned her attention to Sloane, whose face had gone cold. You didn't know, did you? About the apartment, about the money, about how some of those gifts weren't his to give. They were ours, marital assets, which means technically, you've been living in my apartment. Sloane blinked, her mouth slightly open. Nathan shot her a warning look. But it was too late. Clara smiled, not out of pettiness, but out of power. It's easy to believe a lie when it's dressed up in a tailored suit. I did it for 20 years. But not anymore. Arbitrator Cho studied Clara in silence, her expression unreadable, then gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Nathan tried to interrupt, but Julian gently placed a hand on Clara's arm, signaling she'd said enough, for now. She leaned back in her chair, her heartbeat thudding in her ears. But her hands were still. For the first time since all this began, she had spoken her truth aloud. And no one, not even Nathan, could take that from her. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the soft clinking of a gavel as Arbitrator Cho raised it. She looked between the documents before her, then back at Nathan and Clara, her gaze sharp and unwavering. Based on the evidence presented, she began, her voice clear and firm. And in light of the overwhelming documentation of financial misconduct, I am ruling in favor of Mrs. Whitmore. Clara's heart skipped a beat. But she didn't let herself show it. She had learned long ago to mask her emotions. Mrs. Whitmore is entitled to 50% of all disclosed and undisclosed marital assets. This includes, but is not limited to, the assets moved to offshore accounts, personal withdrawals, and the luxury purchases made under an alias. Nathan's face, already pale from the earlier revelations, drained further. He sat frozen, his fingers gripping the edge of the table as though it were the only thing keeping him tethered to the reality around him. Sloane's mouth had gone dry. She hadn't spoken since Clara's declaration, her eyes darting nervously between Nathan and the arbitrator, no longer the confident woman she had been when she walked in. Clara could see the weight of the moment on Sloane's face, too. She hadn't just lost Nathan's empire, she had unwittingly become part of the mess he had created. Arbitrator Cho continued, her voice unwavering. Furthermore, due to Mr. Blackwell's intentional concealment of assets and financial misconduct, I am ordering an independent audit of Blackwell Technologies. Any further hidden assets or irregularities will be subject to additional penalties, including potential criminal charges. The words hit Nathan like a physical blow. Clara couldn't suppress the small spark of satisfaction that ignited in her chest. For the first time in years, Nathan was no longer in control. He wasn't the one calling the shots anymore. Are there any objections? Cho asked, her gaze steady on Nathan. He opened his mouth to protest but then closed it, defeated. As the enormity of the decision sunk in, no words could undo what had just been done. Clara felt the tension that had wound around her chest for months begin to loosen. It was over. The fight wasn't over. But the war? That was won. Cho's gavel struck again, final and resolute. This arbitration is adjourned. Clara stood slowly, feeling the weight of the moment sink in, knowing that everything she had fought for, every sleepless night, every tear, had led to this. And it was hers. It was all hers now. 2 months had passed since the ruling, and Nathan Blackwell's empire had begun to crumble. His business, once a symbol of Silicon Valley success, was now a sinking ship. The independent audit had uncovered even more hidden assets, leading to hefty fines, tax investigations, and even the loss of several major investors. The sleek offices of Blackwell Technologies, once bustling with energy, were now eerily quiet, with employees trickling out as rumors of financial mismanagement and possible criminal charges spread. As for Nathan, he could do nothing but watch as everything he had built began to dissolve. Investors had pulled out, partners had distanced themselves. Worst of all, his once loyal mistress, Sloane, had taken to social media, airing every dirty secret Nathan had tried so hard to conceal. She posted everything, the hidden accounts, the lies, the lavish lifestyle bought with money he'd stolen from Clara, and the world had watched in shock as Nathan's carefully crafted image collapsed into dust. Clara, on the other hand, was thriving. Her phone buzzed in her purse, and she pulled it out with a smile as she saw a message from Isla. Mom, I saw the article. He got what he deserved. I'm so proud of you. Let's celebrate tonight. Clara typed back quickly, her fingers light with excitement. Dinner at our favorite place. My treat. She slipped her phone back into her purse, her heart swelling with pride. As she walked through the bustling streets of Chicago, the air crisp and fresh with the coming fall, Clara didn't look back. She had fought hard for everything she had. And now, for the first time in years, she was free. A new chapter was unfolding before her, and it was hers to write. She had finally found herself again, stronger, more certain, and ready to face whatever came next. The story teaches the powerful lesson of reclaiming one's voice and self-worth in the face of betrayal. Clara's journey reflects the importance of standing up for oneself, even when society or a partner tries to erase your contributions. It highlights the value of resilience, honesty, and the strength found in confronting difficult truths, no matter how seemingly insurmountable the odds. Clara's victory proves that with persistence and integrity, justice can prevail. Ultimately, it reminds us that our past sacrifices don't define us, but our courage to reclaim our future does.